Okay, so let me see if I can give you some feedback on some of the questions that came up in the first discussion board. Um, oops. Okay, first question was from James. Um, um, James says Brown, in his discussion of the benefits of extensive reading, outlines that students who pleasure read, i.e., not looking at words or focusing on grammar, were correlated with higher overall language proficiency. The study quoted Green and Oxford 1995 is arguably dated. True, 1995, but there's been a lot of research since then, and that is a particular claim that has been substantiated. I've given you a couple of more recent references, a study from 2008 by Iwahori, and then a more recent one, 2012, by Takase, both working with Japanese students. And that particular claim is pretty well substantiated. So the more we read extensively, the greater our literacy development in terms of a greater vocabulary and a greater ability to understand texts. Second part of James' question is um, the study the study quoted Green and Oxford is arguably dated. Students today have easier and quicker access to language translations, internet, cell phone, etc. When students pleasure read with English as a second language, do they still avoid looking up translation? If they do in fact utilize translations when pleasure reading, what type of impact does that have on the value of extensive reading? Okay, I can't quote you any research on that. Very interesting questions. One of the things about extensive reading for pleasure, is that there's usually a calculation about looking up words and how far that interrupts the flow of reading. Because when you're reading for pleasure, you really want to find out what happens next. You're less interested in formal features. Um, Probably, as I said, there's not much research on this. One of the most effective ways of looking at words when you're doing extensive reading is using an e-reader, where you can just press on the particular word and you get an instant definition of that word. And that's probably the quickest and the least intrusive in terms of the process of extensive reading. Using iPhones or electronic dictionaries or going online, you can imagine that would interrupt the flow of reading a lot more. So the notion of extensive reading really is that we do immerse ourselves in the reading experience, and we don't look up particular words. And this is true in our first language as well. For every novel or every nonfiction piece of writing that we read, there are going to be a certain amount of words we actually don't understand, but they are not going to interfere with the general understanding of the text. So yeah, interesting questions, but still the notion of extensive reading is vital in terms of literacy development. The problem is, how do you get students to read extensively, especially at a time in the development of reading in which most people, younger people, unfortunately, their ability to read extensively, to read a novel, for example, is that much more reduced. Fewer people are reading in that sense of extensively. More people are reading, of course, but they're reading small amounts of text. Next question is from Casey. Casey says, when first learning a new language, it can be difficult to distinguish between implied and literal meanings. The task requires the application of sophisticated top-down processing skills. What are a few good ways of teaching students how to recognize these in reading and listening? It seems as though these skills are almost self-learnt rather than taught. What kind of activities can be used to better the students at understanding these meanings? Very good question. Difficult. When we talk about skills, we tend to think in terms of something which is internalized. It hasn't been explicitly learned as opposed to particular strategies. Um, One of the keys to understanding whether a text is going to be approachable in terms of literal meaning or in terms of implicit meaning is knowing what kind of text it is. So this is something we know in our L1s. If we're going to read a car manual, for example, it's going to be pretty explicit. We're not expecting any implicit meanings. But depending upon the context, the type of text, then we can expect perhaps there are going to be some implicit meanings there that we have to decode. So a lot of it has to do with recognizing the genre, recognizing the type of text, and what we can expect in terms of explicit and implicit meaning. And that really means that we use a wide range of texts. And so we get students used to this different voices, different ways that information and ideas are going to be presented. Anthony says semantic mapping can be a great way for readers to simplify overwhelming complex text into more digestible strings of ideas. How would you teach this to a class? Would you begin visually on the board with an example map? You're using a term there, semantic mapping, and that's often used at this in the same way as we talk about graphic organizers. I think there's a slight difference. Semantic mapping, as I see it, tends to be the way that we can look at clusters of words that have similar meanings and similar concepts, and the notion of semantic mapping is an attempt to kind of capture in visual form the kinds of organization of vocabulary in the brain. When we think of graphic organizers, I think we think more in terms of the rhetorical structure of a text. And this is vital. This is vital. I argue a lot in the materials I present that we must get away from the notion of comprehension questions to the notion of graphic organizers. A graphic organizer is something that lays bare the structure of the text in a visual format. And the person who's best able to do that and show that to students is the actual teacher. So every text you look at, whether it's reading or it's listening, has a visual representation. It has a graphic organizer. It's for teachers to discover that and to use that instead of comprehension questions. Bailey says, assuming that a student is brand new to learning the English language, what kind of reading materials are the most successful when it comes to improving literacy and comprehension? Again, we can go back to intensive and extensive reading. We want to get our students, whatever level they are, reading extensively right from the beginning. When I talk about reading extensively, I'm talking about reading for pleasure. So is that student reading something that they're really interested in? And they may not be able to go very far into the text, but they're interested in it. So, for example, if you get a newspaper, and I know the actual hard copy newspaper is something which kind of almost obsolete these days. So let's talk about, say, the digital format. Even if you're interested in, say, current affairs, just reading headlines is a type of extensive reading, and that's pleasure reading. So we have to encourage students to read every day in the areas they're most interested in. The second type of reading is intensive reading, and here we're going to try and make a match between the difficulty of the text and the level of the student. Hopefully that particular text will just be a little bit more difficult than what the student can read, but that allows students to go through the text to gain confidence and not to be overwhelmed by too many words. And that's what we call intensive reading. So creating a balance between these two, I think, is essential for developing language proficiency right from the beginning. Catherine says, what is the significance of the characteristics of written language? How can second language teachers use these characteristics to help their students better understand the differences between speaking and reading, as well as to help students become better readers? I think noticing the differences between reading and speaking is probably something that aids the development of writing, perhaps more than it does develop the development of, say, reading. So, one thing we know is that, first off, that speaking is ephemeral, transient. You say it and then it's gone. Um, Words have a way of being permanent. So, in a sense, we have to think a lot more about the kinds of words we choose because they're going to stick around. Think about all those things you've written on your Facebook page that maybe you wish you could delete, but unfortunately, it tends to stick around. Secondly, uh, speaking tends to be what we call rhapsodic. That is, it tends to be a series of short phrases which are conjoined with a conjunction like and. That's the notion of rhapsodic. And that's quite different from writing, where we use a lot more difficult grammar. We use a lot of hierarchical structures. We use subordinate conjunctions because we got the time to construct those. A third difference is the notion of formulaic language. Speaking is often the way of creatively connecting a lot of formulaic language. When we're writing, we have a lot more ability to be more creative with the structure and choice of our words. A fourth difference is the notion of lexical density. When we're writing, because we can edit, we can choose a lot of different words. We can use a lot of synonyms. When we're speaking, we tend to use more simplified language. We tend to use what we call general words, words like things, stuff, that kind of thing. And another difference is, of course, is that speaking is context dependent. That is, when we say things in a context, a situational context, there are non-linguistic factors which allow us to understand what is being said. What if I said, I'll have what she's having? What does that mean? Well, if you've ever seen that movie, what's it called? Oh, I've forgotten the name of the movie. Anyway, there's a famous scene in it in which a particular person says, I'll have what she's having. And if you don't know it, that's because it is context dependent. Writing is context reduced, so that's why we have to use a lot more explicit language. So there are just a few of the differences, and what they kind of feed into often is the notion of writing rather than reading. Sarah says, I found skimming and scanning parts of the reading very interesting. I feel like this is more of an advanced reading strategy, as I can still have issues finding the main point of an article just through skimming, particularly if I'm doing in a second language, German for me. Well, let's just back up here. The notion of an article having uh, a particular main point is very much uh, something that is created pedagogically in terms of what teachers instruct students to do. There is lots of writing that doesn't have an explicit main point for you to skim and find. So in that sense, it's it's referring to a particular genre that you can use skimming in, but it doesn't apply to all genres, and that becomes key when you talk about these reading strategies. The reading strategies work according to a particular genre, and they work according to a particular reading task. So the question is, how does everyone else feel about the scanning skinning concept? Would you use this in a class for beginners? Well, certainly you can use these particular skills at a very beginning age. Scanning means that you're going to look at a text and find a particular piece of information. Um, when you're looking, and you don't do this very often these days, but imagine you're looking in a phone directory, looking for a phone number. What you do is scan. You scan through the particular names alphabetically until you find the one that fits the name that you want to find the number of, and then you find the number. That's scanning, and it's used a lot, of course, to find specific information in a particular text. Skimming is more associated with gist, and you use this in lots of different ways. It may not be particularly the main idea, but it may give you an idea about a particular text. For example, if you're doing research and you've got various abstracts of articles, then you're going to skim those abstracts to find out whether you really want to read the rest of the article. Or think about maybe a movie review. Do you want to read the whole of the movie review, or you just want to find out whether it's recommended or not recommended? So these are examples of skimming. So what I'm saying is that skimming and scanning are particular skills which are related to particular types of genres of text and particular purposes, particular reading purposes. So there's no reason, and it's every reason, why you should use these strategies right from the beginning, but related to the kind of text and the kind of reading purpose. Bethany says, do you think we should encourage students to infer or rely on guessing or compensation strategies more often or less often? What do you guys think would be more effective in the classroom? Do you think the readers will miss the context of the reading if they use scanning too often? Well, as I said, scanning is looking for specific information, and that might be because you've constructed comprehension questions, and this is often the way that comprehension questions work, is they ask you to go into the text and find a specific piece of information. What they don't ask you to do is do global reading to understand the larger meaning of the text itself. So that's another reason why comprehension questions can often really not be the best way of getting students to understand a text. Again, the strategies we use are going to be based on reading purposes and particular texts. It's not a case of one or the other. One of the things we started out was extensive reading and reading for pleasure. We don't really want to interrupt that reading for pleasure by the search for the meaning of too many words, because then the flow and the involvement with the text is halted. And the idea of extensive reading is that we go with the flow of the text. We create an alternative universe in our heads, and we fit that particular text into it. So again, depending on the type of text, the type of task, we're going to use different reading strategies. Okay, thanks for those questions, and I'll be answering more of your questions in discussion board 2.